Fighting in the Somali capital, Mogadishu, has grown fiercer this week than at any other time over the past few months. The conflict between al-Shabaab militants and the weak UN-backed transitional government is just the latest in a 2-decade saga of lawlessness and violence. The al-Shabaab militants, which have been connected with al-Qaeda, withdrew from Mogadishu in August but have stepped up attacks on the city this week. Government forces, which are backed by African Union troops, are reported to be retaliating with tanks and artillery. Fighting in northern districts shows that the government does not fully control the city, despite earlier claims of bringing security following al-Shabaab's retreat. After their tactical withdrawal from Mogadishu, the Islamist militants have launched suicide raids on the capital. The African Union has some 9,000 troops in Mogadishu to stop the internationally backed government from being overthrown. Kenya sent in its own soldiers to southern Somalia in October after a series of cross-border kidnappings that it blamed on al-Shabaab. On Wednesday, the Kenyan parliament agreed to integrate its troops in Somalia into the African Union force. The UN Security Council on Monday passed new sanctions against neighbouring Eritrea for continuing to support Islamist militants, including al-Shabaab. All the while, life for ordinary Somalis remains bleak, with disease and hunger coming in the wake of a drought across the Horn of Africa. At one point, the UN estimated that 750,000 Somalis faced imminent starvation. That number has now fallen to 250,000 as aid convoys progress through the drought-stricken south, despite some opposition from al-Shabaab fighters. Here is the voice of Mahmoud Aden Ahmed, who was forced from his home in the southern Bokol region by the drought.
We came here after God had taken all our livestock. We could not get food, but when we came here, they gave us relief food. We get a bit of assistance, but not on everything. This is our situation.
Somalia has endured more than 2 decades of war and, for much of that time, had no functioning government. The transitional federal government exists only by virtue of foreign troops and controls little more than the capital city. To discuss Somalia's many problems, I spoke by telephone with Roland Marchal, a fellow at the Centre for International Studies and Research in Paris. I started by asking him whether he thought al-Shabaab is looking to regain control of Mogadishu.
I doubt at this time, but certainly they want to make a point that whatever is happening in the most southern part near the Kenyan border, Shabaab is still very strong, still capable to strike, even in the capital city, and as well as in other parts of the country, and I believe they just want to underline that Shabaab is still far from being defeated, and I believe they are right in that.
Now you mentioned Kenya, which has recently joined in the fighting and has now decided to contribute to the African Union force. Is this going to be enough to bolster what can only be described as a floundering central government in Somalia?
Oh, I doubt very much. I believe it's the Kenyan intervention in Somalia was very badly planned, and his cost is actually getting very high since the intervention is lasting much longer than expected initially. So therefore, to get into AMISOM may allow the Kenyan government to have access to UN on Western funding for the operation, and maybe save its face, since Kenya militarily has done, let's say, little.
The UN Security Council imposed a new round of sanctions against Eritrea this week over their support for the al-Shabaab. In your opinion, is that going to be enough to deter their support for the Islamist insurgents?
2 points. The first is many diplomats in Nairobi doubt that the current Eritrean support to Shabaab is significant. I think the sanctions or the resolution as taken by the UN Security Council intends to show support to Kenya and to the regions against al-Shabaab more than really making a definitive move against Eritrea. Eritrea over the last months has been more cautious. And certainly, before Kenyan intervention, people were expecting the sanctions to be kept as they were, but not increased dramatically. So we have, again, more a show of solidarity with Kenya and the region than really a crude assessment of Eritrean responsibility in the Somali crisis.
Now, that's the politics. All the while, ordinary Somalis face what can only be described as a very bleak situation. Drought, disease, hunger. What's the latest on the humanitarian situation in the Horn of Africa?
Let us say we just enter into the new rainy season, and rain seems to be good. But of course, the real assessment will be made only when the long rainy seasons later in 2012.
One final question for you, Roland. In your opinion, how much longer do you think the international community will continue to back the transitional government, which, even after all this time, still does not control anything really beyond the capital city?
And they do control the capital city only because of the presence of international troops. Let us say the next August 2012 might be a moment of choice. But maybe what the Kenyan intervention means and what's going to happen now is a kind of Balkanization of Somalia. Every country of the region may try to have its own buffer zone set up as a federal state, because Somalia is supposed to be a federation. And in that sense, we may get into a situation where a central government in Mogadishu is no more needed. Only regional governments will be there. But one thing is sure: if this scenario takes place, Shabab has a bright future for Somalia and for the region.
That was Roland Marchal, a Fellow of the Centre of International Studies and Research in Paris.